So I'm Professor Joan DeBardeleben from the Institute of European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies, and I'm going to be moderating this event today. Before we begin, I'd just like to acknowledge that this event is being organized from Carleton University in Ottawa, and that this is located on the unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation. This is the second of our teach-ins on the war in Ukraine. The last one was last week, just 1 week ago today. And a lot has happened in that passing week. The intensity of the conflict, I think we should say, has increased. There's been a hyped up rhetoric from the Russian authorities. There have been rising civilian casualties and a continuing flood of refugees entering EU countries near Ukraine. Alongside this has been an accelerating pace of meetings among Western allies, Western and other allies, to discuss how to respond to the war, including, as you may have noticed today, a NATO summit meeting, a meeting of the European Council, and a meeting of the G7, as well as a series of speeches by Ukrainian President Zelensky to parliaments in countries such as West Germany, as countries in the West, such as Germany, Japan, and France. So our purpose really here is to allow, to give students particularly, and welcome Carleton students, a chance to consult and listen to some of the experts we have from Carleton as well as from elsewhere on this topic. And so the way we're going to, I'll first tell you a little bit about how we're going to run the session, and then I'll open it up. Before I do that, I just want to mention that the video of the teach-in last week is on the EURUS webpage, which will be, the address will be put in the chat. And that the Institute of European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies, which we call EURUS, is also hosting an online discussion board that will feature contributions from our faculty members and others over the course of the next little while. It's already being posted now and has, I think, already two or three contributions on it. And you can access that also from the EURUS webpage. So this can give you up-to-date analysis further after this event about what's going on with the war in Ukraine and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So the way we're going to run this is that we have 4 expert panelists. Very pleased. Thank you to our panelists for coming. And they will each open with about a very short comment on a question that I will address to them. And that will give you an opportunity to formulate your questions, which you can put into the question and answer box. And then I will present those questions, as many as possible, to the panelists after they make their opening statements. So we should have quite a lot of time for questions. So get your question machine working, and anything you've been wondering about, feel free to pose to our panelists. So before we start, I'll just mention briefly who our panelists are. First speaker will be Professor Jeff Sahadeo at the Institute. He's a professor at the Institute of European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies here at Carleton. He is a historian by training, and he studies issues of nationality, migration, colonialism, and daily life in the Soviet Union and Russia, Eurasia. Our second panelist is Professor Andrea Chandler, who's also a professor in the political science department at Carleton. She teaches courses on comparative politics, post-communist politics, democracy, gender, and identity in that part of the world. She's the author of 3 single-authored books, the most recent being Democracy, Gender, and Social Policy in Russia. And her current research is dealing with Canada's foreign relations with East European countries during the Cold War, with a recent article on Canada and the Czechoslovak crisis of 1968. Our third panelist is Mariia Shynkarenko, and she is not a Carleton faculty member, but she's visiting us as a PhD candidate in politics at the New School in New York. Her dissertation explores the instrumentalization of collective identities as tactics of resistance in the Crimean Tatars movement for self-determination. More broadly, she's interested in Crimean Tatars, Ukrainian politics, and identity. And she has published a recent article on compliance subjects, how the Tatars in Crimea resist Russian occupation. Finally, Agnieszka Weinar is currently an adjunct research professor here at the Institute of European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies. Previously, she worked at the European University Institute in Florence, Italy, as the scientific coordinator and research fellow, and also at the European Commission as a policy officer. Her research interests include skilled migration, labor market integration of highly skilled migrants, and policies of recognition of qualifications and skills, as well as trade and mobility. She served as an expert for the European Commission, the World Bank, the International Organization of Migration, and has authored and co-authored over 50 academic and policy relevant publications. So I think you'll see we have a very broad range of expertise, and hopefully among our 4 experts, they'll be able to address most of your questions. So I'm going to start out by posing a question to Professor Sahadeo. So first, the question for you. Looking at the Russian justification for the invasion of Ukraine, Putin has said one of its goals is the denazification of Ukraine. What is he referring to? And how is this message being received at home in Russia, in your view?
Yeah, it may sound to us a little bit of hyperbole to be focusing so much on a word that clearly does not apply to modern-day Ukraine, or certainly not to the Ukrainian government. When we try and look at it through Putin's eyes, we see he's trying to accomplish a number of different things. Of course, for us, even the Second World War is a major event in our memories. But when you think of the Soviet Union, which lost 27 million people altogether, and really that moment still remains sort of a foundational legitimizing moment for the post-war Soviet Union and then for the Russian Federation that came afterwards. So people of Putin's generation still remember the Second World War if they didn't experience it directly, and still consider it as one reason why Russia today needs to be conscious of its security, ultra conscious of its security. So there's that memory that he's tapping into, that sense of insecurity, that there's always Nazis at the door, or really just, in a way, it's a broader catch-all term for just evil enemies. Now, he also is referring to some of the far-right groups in Ukraine. Ukraine does have an active far-right movement. You might say it might even be fewer in number than the United States, but they exist. There was a controversy, especially shortly after the Orange Revolution, when Viktor Yushchenko came in, sort of sponsored by the West, in a sense, that's how Putin would say it, elevating a man named Stepan Bandera, and often you hear Putin talk about Banderites as well, who was a more or less a Nazi collaborator in the Second World War, who has been seen by some Ukrainians in the West as a fighter for Ukrainian sovereignty. And Putin has been able to mobilize these words, and his audience is not us, right? His audience is not the West. He's not trying to convince us. He's trying to convince his own population. And he talks about the fact that there are Nazis in Western Ukraine. Okay, there's a small number of them. It may sound to us, again, silly that he talks about the Nazis in the Ukrainian government when Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, has Jewish heritage, and this is they're clearly not more than a fringe element in the Ukrainian government, although the Ukrainian sort of state, even though they exist. But it is something that evokes a visceral feeling among Russians who see Ukraine as critical, and control of Ukraine is critical, as preventing either Nazis from the Western Ukraine or Germans in a larger term from invading Russia again. So he tries to play on that sense of insecurity on the one hand, and also a sense that he is the one who can uproot these Nazis, get rid of them, and decapitate this threat. Now, he's failed to do that, obviously, and he's probably talked a little bit less about Nazification recently because he thought he would be able to get rid of the Ukrainian government in relatively short order, and then he could be a successful denazifier, but that hasn't happened yet. And so it remains to be seen how he'll organize himself after this initial failure, and that'll be the conversation for, I think, much of the night. But so this term has a historical resonance It's mobilized politically. It has a resonance with the Russian population. How deep it is, we're not sure yet.
Thank you very much, Jeff. And now I'll move on to Andrea. And I wanted to ask you, how do you think the sanctions that the West has imposed are affecting average people in Russia? And is there a realistic possibility that they could have an impact on Russian policy?
It's interesting. Russia has a lot of experience of living with a sanctioned economy because after Lenin and the Bolsheviks came to power in the Soviet Union, the Soviet economy developed as a sanctioned economy to a certain extent because Lenin had repudiated the debts that had been incurred by the Tsarist Russian regime and took Russia out of the war unilaterally. So part of the reason why the Soviet Union developed as a command economy was because there were relatively few opportunities for borrowing or purchasing of imports from abroad because of the very tight economic constraints they were into. So the question is what to expect when sanctions as sweeping as the ones in the last month have been introduced. We can expect, and I think we know this from our past familiarity with the Russian and the Soviet economy. We can expect some degree of shortages which affect consumers, some degree of bottlenecks in domestic production if firms can't get the parts or the supplies that they need. And when shortages occur, we can expect things like hoarding, the black market, that consumers will not be able to get the imported goods they're used to having. So we just don't know the scale, the scope of how intense this will be because it's a kind of an abrupt set of sanctions to be introduced in a country under conditions of globalization. So there's probably unintended consequences of sanctions that will become more apparent the longer they go on. For the Russians who remember the late 1980s and the 1990s, more worrisome to them than the privations they're experiencing right now, which may not be that intense, might be the feeling of day-to-day insecurity, remembering the hyperinflation and the ruble crash of the 1990s. So this sense of dread about what could happen. So how will citizens respond to this politically? Perhaps many of them will rally around the flag and accept their government's narrative that they're threatened by NATO, the discourse that Professor Sahadeo was talking about. Others may well keep their heads down out of just not wanting to get involved in politics, and still others have emigrated. I would just say this, first, the sanctions represent a sudden change, more intense than the last round of sanctions in 2014 and in the aftermath of the annexation of Crimea. So they're likely to have some spin-off effects that are more acute under conditions of 21st century globalization than 50 or 100 years ago when there were fewer transnational communications and less transnational trade. And Putin has not prepared his citizens to make sacrifices for the good of the nation. He's prepared them, I think, to think of themselves as a great nation and that they will prevail and prosper under his iron will. So how is he going to tell them now that they might have to tighten their belts and get used to deprivations? There hasn't been preparation for that. He's told the population that as long as they toe the line politically, they can expect things to be relatively stable and calm for them. Now, Putin has glitzy television and disinformation working for him. But don't we know from the 1980s that in the long run, state propaganda can be very challenged by the rumor mills that flourish when transparency from the government becomes as scarce as a decent bottle of wine. In Putin's first 2 terms as president, from 2000 to 2008, he offered his own version of a social contract. Under his watch, pensions and benefits would be paid. Most people could expect more stable incomes than what they'd had before. And a middle class would see their living standards improve, provided they didn't make waves politically. There was always an undercurrent of menace to this social contract, always. That Putin would restore law and order and would make some scapegoated group pay for the shortcomings of the 1990s. The first scapegoats included Chechens and politically independent oligarchs. Later scapegoats were liberals, LGBTQ individuals, and bloggers such as Alexei Navalny. But Putin's social contract has been shaky, I would say, ever since the 2008 financial crisis and the fall in oil prices in recent years. The raising of the pension age in 2018 brought a wave of protests that suggested that there was perceived anger among some of the citizenry at the violation of the social contract, because Putin had promised in 2005 at one of his famous call-in shows that pension ages would never increase as long as he was president. And people, as it turned out, remembered that he had said this. So these protests were a kind of warning sign, an opportunity for Putin to develop a more sound economic plan that would make the pension system somewhat more sustainable and to reconfigure the social contract, which had not been kind of updated for a long time. But it was a missed opportunity. Instead of regrouping and reconnecting with citizens, Putin drafted a constitutional reform and called upon citizens to come out to the polls in the middle of a pandemic in June 2020, even though a referendum was not necessary for the articles of the Constitution that he proposed to change. How long before Russian citizens asked the quintessential Russian question, Zачем? Why are we doing these costly things, changing the Constitution, fighting a war against Ukraine? Will the population demand change? Well, I think right now, as we all know, there's so many barriers, really too much repression to imagine a unified political opposition that could produce some sort of organized protest from the public, at least not anytime soon. But when we look at past historical cases where regimes have weakened, in Russia, what stands out in my mind is the impact of sporadic, scattered, but sustained withdrawals of citizen compliance, as, for example, occurred before this February 1917 revolution in Russia. A cascade of small mutinies, strikes, isolated protests, and the escalating spread of disease and other problems when too many people are displaced and compelled to live in crowded conditions. All these things can wear down state capacity until things start to fall apart. As for my prediction of whether the Russian government will respond to the impact of sanctions on the population, that's an easy question to answer. I think no. I think this government has completely lost its way. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrea. And now to Mariia. How do you assess Ukrainian resistance to the Russian invasion? And do you see a realistic possibility for a negotiated ceasefire from Ukraine's perspective?
Thank you for the question, and thank you for inviting me. I have to make a disclosure. I'm a Ukrainian citizen, and my family is in Ukraine, so this war is personal to me, which kind of clouds my judgment, but I am trying to be as objective as possible. Answering your question, I think that Ukrainians have never been more united and strong before. Putin thought that he will come to Ukraine and people and liberate Ukraine, and people will meet him with flowers, especially in the regions that were long termed as Russian speaking and very incorrectly interpreted as pro-Russian. And what we are seeing now is that even the regions that have been termed in that way, they are showing so much resistance and just so much courage on a very personal level. And we see huge lines of people who are signing up to fight, people with no experience. We see more than 180,000 men coming back from abroad, Ukrainians coming back from abroad to fight in the army. We see just daily kind of anecdotal evidence of people resisting on a very local level. The farmers who steal the tanks with their with the tractors, grandmas who are standing and stopping the Russian tanks with their bare hands. And we see especially Kherson and Melitopol, the southern regions that are closer to Crimea, that are now temporarily occupied by the Russian forces. We see people going actually out on a peaceful protest in the city squares and chant, "Go home," and Ukraine and Slava Ukraini. So this all testifies just how united people are and how determined they are not to let Russia occupy even an inch of the territory. So about the possibility for a negotiated ceasefire from Ukraine's perspective, we also see that there are attempts to negotiate with the Russian side. And in my opinion, this is the correct way to, the right way to do, the right thing to do. The negotiations merely concern now the what they call the green corridors, the evacuation for citizens, because Russia is wiping out cities. They are destroying, just obliterating everything. And in many cities, such as Mariupol and Izium and Volnovakha, Bucha, Irpin, there is no conditions at all. It is a artificially made humanitarian catastrophe. So the governments are negotiating, even though we see how Russia is violating those corridors every day, just shooting civilians. So even if I think that it is important to negotiate, it is important to negotiate the corridors. I don't think that ceasefire is possible, that any deal with Putin is possible. The views on what Ukraine is and how it should be are just very different, and there's just no points of agreement. Putin thinks that Ukrainian nation is not real, it shouldn't exist, and he is annihilating the whole nation. So our government will not go, will not allow, if there was before, there was some, before the war, yeah, also it's important to mention that, Ukraine has been in a war for 8 years now, and we did have the, we had the Minsk agreement. We already have the ceasefire agreement with the Donbas area. So this agreement has been constantly violated for 8 years. So there is just no expectation and no trust between the states to even hope that any such agreement in the future will work. So Ukrainian citizens understand that, and the Ukrainian government also understand that, so far as as Putin is the president of Russia, no such agreement is possible.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Mariia. And now a final question that I'll propose is to Agnieszka. Can you briefly provide your thoughts on the medium and long-term implications for European countries, EU countries, of the refugee crisis that's resulting from this war?
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for inviting me. I wanted to share a few thoughts that I had. So I will not talk about long term, because long term now we cannot speculate. We don't know what can happen. We don't even know what can happen in short term. But as we are looking at the situation on the ground, we have now 3.5 million refugees in the European Union. This number actually grows every day, because even in one border crossing in Poland, we have basically 100,000 people crossing every day. So the Commission plans for at least 5 million in the coming weeks. And as we all know, 90% of these people are women and children, which is very different from any other refugee flow that the European Union has experienced in the last 50 years. But then we also know that there are at least 12 million people who have been displaced inside Ukraine, and we don't know what will happen with them. Would they not be also tempted to leave the country at one point? So yes, we have quite a huge flow. And what does it mean? There are basically two ways of looking at this. So I think that the idea of return, this is what we were hearing at the beginning of the conflict, that the conflict will probably end quickly, and then all these people would actually return. This is becoming not realistic in the midterm, and not only because the war might take longer than everybody thought, but also because of the tactics explained by Mariia. People have to have a place to return. If the country is in the very bad state as regards infrastructure, the return will take potentially years. And we know that from other conflicts around the globe, that this is how it works usually. So we are now looking at the positive and maybe positive effects, because there are some, and a few risks. And let me enumerate them very quickly. So on the positive note, I would say that this situation had a very good impact on the Central Eastern European countries, which are now having a crash course on integration and immigration policies. These policies had been absolutely denied for 30 years. So a country like Poland, like Slovakia or Czech Republic, they were not really interested in building any type of a system, not only for refugees, but also for immigrants. So integration or reception was absolutely not on the top of the agenda. And now they have to build the capacity very quickly and learn the policy. So this is good because this will actually make these countries capable members of the European Union and can strengthen the asylum system of the EU in the long run. Then another thing that I noted was the solidarity. For years, European Union was unable to build a solidarity response towards refugees. And now in 1 week, they were able to use new instruments. I mean, old instruments in a new way. And I'm talking here about the cohesion funds that the Commission is using for their care program that will help the member states which host refugees, that they were unable to do this for Italy, Greece, or Malta before. So this is a new development. And the last thing that I wanted to underline is that maybe, just maybe, this influx, which is, as I said, again, mainly the mothers and the children, will have an impact on building what we call social Europe. Because these refugees do not only need the right to work, these are single mothers. Single mothers are a very vulnerable group, and now we have millions of them. So it means that we will have to build or harmonize the ways we support women and children across the European Union. So this might be a positive effect in the future. And the risks, I don't want to talk about the risks too much because they make me very nervous, but I can see clearly the risks of growing instability. We have seen that the support for refugees in the Syrian crisis lasted basically 1 year. And then it all ended up in the growing right-wing parties and populism. And unfortunately, this is a big risk because we are also at the same time experiencing the economic the downturn that is related to COVID and to war. And this can be very easily used by the Russian disinformation, as it was the case in the Syrian crisis. So I will stop here, and I'm happy to answer any question.
Okay, thank you very much, Agnieszka. We have only about 25 minutes left, so we have a number of questions. So I'd ask the panelists to please be very brief in their responses. Please no more than 2 minutes each when you answer questions. And I'll put out a couple of questions and ask who wants to respond to them. The first one is, where is the red line for the West in this conflict? And I think what's meant by that, is there a point at which the West would decide that it had to engage militarily in the conflict in a way that it so far has been unwilling to do? And the second question relates to Russia, whether Russia's heading into a new era of isolation with the sanctions and the restrictions on travel, or possibly to an economic collapse, which could potentially also lead the oligarchs to oust him from power. So would someone like to take on either one of those two questions? Again, please be quite brief. I will give you this signal if I think you're going on too long, because we have to get on to more of the questions.
I'll start and take just a quick stab. And I think the red line for the West in the conflict is NATO. If a NATO country is attacked, or if Russia goes beyond the borders of Ukraine, and it's been careful not to. I mean, there was that one strike in the west of Ukraine that it perpetrated a few days back, but they have not done this since gone into the western parts of Ukraine, and they have not attacked, which might be a red line, is supply chains for Western arms going into Ukraine. I don't know if NATO would consider that a red line or the West would, but certainly if Russian troops by accident or by design bomb, say, a territory in Poland or in the Baltics, and I think that's a red line for NATO. I'll stop there. I'll let others answer some questions.
Yeah, just to follow up, what about chemical weapon attack or a tactical nuclear weapon attack within Ukraine? Would that be a red line?
I mean, it would be a red line, but I don't know what you can say it's a red line, but a red line to what? I mean, I
don't know what
I have a hard time seeing NATO responding to something that's going on in Ukraine. I think it would be, I don't know how actionable it would be. I don't know.
Yeah, okay. So on the question of, is Russia entering a period of isolation or economic collapse? Does anyone want to take that question on? Either perhaps Andrea or Jeff, either one of you have a comment on that?
Well, I would just say about isolation that it's hard to be totally isolated from the international environment in the 21st century. So that whatever isolation Russia experiences now is going to be different from the isolation that existed behind the Iron Curtain during the Cold War or under Stalin, where it was easier for the state to control the movement of goods and people and things. It's harder now to stop the flow of everything, and it also seems like to some extent the Russian government has been willing to allow people to leave, which the Soviet Union was not keen on. They didn't want to lose labor power or brain drain, although there is some indication that they don't want military aged men to leave. So it's different, but it's more a question, I think, of Russia becoming isolated from diplomacy, which in a way is a bigger problem. I mean, it's one thing for them to be self-sufficient, to have to be self-sufficient as an economy and as a society, but to be totally outside the realm of international diplomacy, where we've had norms not only since the Second World War, but for hundreds of years, there just doesn't seem to be very many normative restraints, and that's on on Putin's behavior, and that concerns me. Regarding economic collapse, I think sometimes when we see a serious problem occurring in Russia, we tend to look for the revolution, the collapse, the overthrow, the coup, and those kinds of events are uncommon in Russia. Not to say that they couldn't happen, because there's a history of authoritarian leaders who cling to power and don't want to engage in change. So being swept from power is sometimes a consequence of that. But I think the point that I was trying to make is the sporadic and incremental and at times sudden weakenings of state capacity and legitimacy.
Thank you, Andrea and Jeff. Okay, now I have a few questions on Ukraine, and the first one, past, present, and future. The first one, Zelensky has said that Ukraine does not expect to join NATO. Would it make a difference if he'd said this on February 23rd? That's one question. And doesn't that stand now in somewhat contradiction to his consideration, his request for accelerated consideration of membership in the EU? So on the one hand, saying doesn't expect to be in NATO, but putting the request for an accelerated membership in the EU, is that a contradiction? That's one question. A second question relates to the bio labs that Russia alleges are in Ukraine, and whether they exist, whether they were funding Western-owned GMO research or some kind of agri-crops, or what's the story with those? Is that a total fabrication, or is there something behind that? And then the third question, which is, once this war is over, what would be some of the challenges of post-war reconstruction? Of course, it depends on how and when the war ends, but maybe either Agnieszka or Mariia would have a comment on one or the other of these questions.
Okay, I can take a few, and those are really big questions that can take a lot of time to answer, but I think they are very important, and I'll just try to respond as quickly as possible. So about the rumors of biolabs in Ukraine, no, that's not true. This is propaganda that Putin, out of very familiar Putin's cookbook, and we know that every time they are making accusations, that means that they are preparing to do something like that. So the UN has confirmed that there is no such biolabs in Ukraine, and but there is a very high possibility that Russia might themselves make a chemical or biological weapon attack on Ukraine. So another question about Zelensky and the NATO, would it have made a difference if it had said this on the 23rd February? No. The NATO is it's a red herring. NATO has never been a real reason why Putin has invaded Ukraine. NATO has never posed a threat to Russia, and Russia is using NATO as a way to put the responsibility on the West for the conflict. I want to kind of point out that Russia has invaded Ukraine in 2014, first time. And before that, Ukraine had no intention of joining NATO. NATO had this open door policy, but the support for joining NATO among Ukrainians was very small. It only rose after Russia invaded Ukraine, and after Russia invaded Ukraine, it became a part of our constitution. Yeah, I think I'm just gonna stop there.
Agnieszka, do you have any thoughts about the EU question particularly?
Yeah, so I just want to make clear that since 2008, so that was the time when Russia actually invaded Georgia, right? We had the very same situation, and already there it was very clear that NATO understood that they should not push for new members. So it wasn't as if, we had on one hand this open door policy, and on the other hand, inside, everybody knew that that wouldn't really happen. And so there was this way of trying to involve the so-called Eastern partners. These are the 6 countries that exist between Russia and the European Union in a way, to involve them economically, socially, culturally, and politically as close as possible with the European Union, instead of any military alliance, and that's actually happened with the Ukraine. So, for example, Ukrainian citizens or citizens of Armenia or Moldova or Georgia had very different rights in the EU than anybody else. So there is this very strong association. We have association agreement, the free trade agreement with the Ukraine. It was very close to actual integration, and that was Actually, we were on that path, you know, but of course that would require Ukraine to go through this series of reforms, and that would take time. So I think that that this is, of course, you know, asking for the EU membership and accelerator procedure. This doesn't work because this does not exist. I mean, there is no accelerated procedure in the treaties of the European Union. You have to meet the conditions. That's it. But you know, it's all in the hands of Ukrainians in the future.
Okay, thank you, Agnieszka. Now, understandably, there's a lot of questions here about how this war and when it might end, and any of your thoughts on that would be appreciated. Is there any foreseeable outcome that would have Crimea and those eastern regions of Ukraine returned to Ukraine? What would the West do when the war does end? Will the sanctions be lifted? Might there even be reparations paid by Russia to Ukraine? And on the other hand, what happens if Russia or if Putin is actually charged with war crimes? What's the consequence of that? So a lot of future speculation, I think, here, which nobody really definitively knows the answers to, but our experts may have a few insights or thoughts. Jeff, do you want to start out on that?
Okay, I can take the speculation. I just didn't want to go back to this NATO question. I would agree with Masha that, as Zelensky said, no NATO on February 23rd, it wouldn't have made a difference. But that doesn't necessarily mean that NATO is not an issue. And we may think that NATO doesn't pose a threat to Russia. The Russians sure think it poses a threat to them, and not just Putin. And I do think this was Putin's legacy project, was to make sure that Ukraine would be solidly in the Russian orbit and could never even threaten to join NATO or have conduct exercises with NATO powers, which it had been doing, buying weapons that they're using now quite effectively against the Russians. So I think that that was certainly in Putin's calculations. About the future, of course, we don't know. I mean, the questions as you pose them to Joan seem to indicate people are girding for more of a Western kind of Ukrainian at least either stalemate or a settlement that would be favorable to Ukraine. It's possible, of course, we don't know. I don't think that Putin's regime is going to survive this in one form or another, but that could mean 1 year or it could mean 10 years. I mean, as Andrea said earlier on, these regimes can tend to kind of keep plugging along. But it's clear that Putin has failed in his objectives. He won't be able to decapitate the Ukrainian regime. He won't be able to easily install a pro-Russian government. So if he takes Ukraine, he'll have to deal with it, and he doesn't have the strength or the will to get there. But I don't really see a scenario, for example, where the Russians would be paying serious reparations to Ukraine, specifically because one of the problems is going to be Russia is going to also be damaged at this point. And if we continue the logic that NATO has been going along so far, is we only want, there are areas that we don't want to provoke the Russians because we're afraid of nuclear weapons. Do we want a Russia so poor and so humiliated, and you think of the Weimar scenario after the First World War, that it could become even more dangerous? So I think there would have to be some kind of settlement that maybe Russia would be involved in rebuilding, but I think it would have to be whatever settlement there is, we'll have to take into account that a Russia that's humiliated, a Russia that's lost, or a potential failed state in Russia is far more dangerous than a settlement that would, in fact, maybe not give the Ukrainians what they want. But there is a scenario where Ukraine could get maybe the Donetsk and Luhansk back. It's very unlikely to see how they would get Crimea back, given the referendum that was held there.
Andrea, please.
Yeah, I mean, just that we hear these various arguments that, oh, if the West had done X, or if Ukraine had done Y, then none of this would have happened. And I just don't understand the logic of this argument, because I think that in the months leading up to the invasion, Zelensky was doing everything except standing on his head to try to get a dialogue going with Russia and to try to get the world to take this issue seriously. So the problem, I don't think, lies with what Ukraine did or didn't do, or what Zelensky did or didn't do, because the whole issue of wanting to possibly join NATO had to do with a response to a threat from Russia that didn't seem to be going away. And the idea that if NATO and or Ukraine and Russia had made some sort of agreement with Russia, perhaps for Ukraine to remain neutral, why would we think that that's going to solve the entire problem, when what we've seen from Putin is a disregard for international commitments and for international laws? Like, what would make him magically comply with this agreement about a neutral Ukraine when he's being investigated by the International Criminal Court, when he violated multiple treaties in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea? It seems to me that there's a bit of magical thinking if we think that there's some sort of hypothetical agreement that could have been made up to now that would have satisfied the Russian side. With respect to, could Russia give up Crimea? I mean, I think anything is possible. There are wars in history that have ended with unconditional surrenders, that have ended with losses of territory. You know, these things are possible. It's a little hard to imagine with Crimea because Russia has a big naval base there. So there's quite a lot of military power in that region. But also, I think whatever post-war settlement occurs is going to need to grapple with this fact, I think, that the Russian side has lost confidence of Western countries and of Ukraine, that it's going to comply with any agreements that it makes. And so the question is, how would Russia address that loss of confidence in any agreement that it might want to make to end the war?
Thank you very much. So we have about 5 minutes left, and I have 3 questions I'm going to pose, but I'll give you each 1 minute to respond either to those questions or to something else you want to say. The first question is, what do you make of Anatoly Chubai's resignation? That's sort of a question for those who study Russian politics, but we can see if someone can answer that one. Second one, does the West understand Russia? And if not, why not? Asking that to us Russian specialists, that's a good question, I think. And finally, the Russian decision to demand payments for natural gas with rubles to unfriendly countries. What do you see as the implication of that move on the part of Russia? So you each have 1 minute. You can answer those. If you can't, then give your summing up thoughts, please. So I'll go in the same order. Jeff, you want to start?
Chubai was the most likely one to flee. I mean, he's always been on the more liberal side, so I don't think that that's a big surprise. I think you'd have to see somebody who was more of an actual Silovik or somebody who was really a hawk break ranks before we think there's any kind of regime instability, or that could happen. And we won't be able to see it because we don't understand Russia, obviously, as well as we'd like. But I think it is important, and I think in this hour, we've hopefully tried to give you a bit of a sense of the way the perspectives come in from Russia and come in from the West, and that Russians perceive this conflict in a very different way than the West does. And not just Russians, people who are not in liberal democratic countries and don't place a normative value on liberal democratic regimes. Seen in a different way, and I think it's important to have those perspectives. I think on the ruble question, it's a bit of a symbolic thing. I think the West said, well, we have agreements to pay in euros or pay in dollars. I don't think it's going to make a huge difference. I think it's just Putin trying to play some kind of game to show his economic power, but until he actually shuts the taps off. Once they do that, then things will get serious. Until that point, I'm not going to lose much sleep over it.
Okay, Andrea, your final comment.
I'll defer my time to the other two panelists.
Okay, thank you. And so, Mariia?
Yeah, I'll answer the question about the misunderstanding of Putin. I do think that the West has been and continues to misunderstand Putin, and we've seen it through all his 22 years of rule. Every time he disregards the rule of law, every time he disregards the international law, invades a country, the response has, up until now, the response has never been adequate to, a power that violates ruthlessly an international law. We saw that in Georgia, in Ukraine in 2014. We see that with Russian meddling in elections of almost every European country and the US, in cyber attacks, and now when Russians are literally throwing bombs on the Ukrainian cities and threatened with the nuclear war, I think that the West starts to understand what kind of regime it is. But still, I think that that understanding is not complete, because Putin is a bully who only understands the rule of force, and he the framing of that the West is using now of not intervention, of trying not to escalate, kind of tiptoeing around Putin's demands, makes him more powerful. He feels that he is setting the agenda, that he is putting those red lines, that he is that everyone is afraid of him, everyone is afraid of what he will do, and that makes him in his eyes stronger, and the West is weaker. So I think that is a big mistake on the part of the West.
Thank you very much. And now finally, Agnieszka, you get the final word. 1 minute.
My God, I just want to maybe this time support again what Mariia said, and coming from Central Europe myself, I always had a different view of Russia and the Russian government, of course, and because I'm also feeding on different media than the Western media, probably I also had a different perspective on what was happening. However, I just wanted to put here two things. It's not that that West that does not understand Russia. There are also other countries that do not understand Russia. But these countries around the world, and I just want to underline this, they are watching. So when we say that 141 countries voted in the United Nations to condemn Russia, for me, it's really not enough. And then when you look at the list of the countries who abstained, these are countries that are basically watching with whom they will have to work in the future. And I think that this is a very, very, very dangerous and delicate moment in our history. And I don't think that actually the populations, at least in Western Europe, from what I can see in the narrative, I don't think that we are prepared to fully understand what is happening and what the stakes really are now. As a European, for me, it was very meaningful that many African countries really did not take any side, and we all know why. But I think that that was a surprise for the Europeans. I just want to say that.
Okay, thank you so much to all of our panelists and for also trying to squeeze your answers into this very confined time. And especially to all the students who attended and who posed questions, as well as other members of the Carleton community. We aren't finished at EURUS with our discussion of this topic. So as mentioned, we have a discussion platform, a kind of blog that's going to be updated regularly on the EURUS website. I think the website address has been put in the chat, so you can note that down. But if you can't find it, you can just Google Institute of European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at Carleton and you'll find it. You can also find the video of last week's teach-in, and I presume that the video of this one will likely be posted fairly soon as well. So thank you. The discussion will continue. Unfortunately, I don't think this war is going to end that soon, so we'll probably have ample time to continue our discussion, although we all maintain hope that some kind of satisfactory negotiated settlement can be achieved that will be favorable to Ukraine. So good evening, have a good evening to everybody, and thanks again for coming.